Let's move on to this now. If the electoral system can't be fixed, it must be overhauled. That's the view of One South Africa Movement's Mmusi Maimane. He says the amendment bill, as it stands, will always favour political parties. He says the system can be proportional or fair, but it can't be both. Last month, the Constitutional Court granted Parliament an extension to its initial deadline to amend the Electoral Act to allow independent candidates to stand in all elections. Mmusi Maimane joins me now to take that conversation forward. And Mmusi, I suppose before we go any further, I imagine that you would want to weigh in on the violence that we have seen in your home area of Soweto. This is in Orlando, and I imagine that you share this sense of shock and outrage at what happened at that tavern.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to fellow South Africans. This is indeed a great tragedy. I think I want to send my condolences to the family members. What is going on in our country is simply something that we cannot sit back and watch the horror that is ongoing. The young people who are being killed, and murder and violence in our nation has been going on for far too long. And ultimately, what we've got to ask ourselves is, are law enforcement agencies effective? And clearly the answer is no. And furthermore, can we as a nation begin to say to ourselves, we had a state of emergency around COVID. Surely, with 67 people dying every single day through murder, can't we have a state of emergency around violent crime in this country and say to ourselves, we are going to target nothing else but murder in our nation?
Yeah. I can find no fault in what you are saying, Mmusi, that it has become an emergency because despite all the measures announced recently around the recruitment of police officers to add to the numbers, my sense has been that, we are under-policed. There are multiple ways of tackling crime. There's the issues around prevention and, making sure that people don't follow that path, the socio-economics of it all. But there's also issues that have to do with response. In measuring up, in your mind, where are we lacking mostly? I know about the socio-economic challenges we face around unemployment, inequality, and poverty. Those are issues that are objective realities that we are dealing with. But one gets the sense that over and above that, we are dealing with issues of capability. The numbers are just not there. The gaps are being plugged in many instances by private security more than it is the state. But if you can't have that in certain communities, well, then you are sitting ducks.
Well, I think more than anything, what we've got to say to ourselves when we respond to the question of manpower, we've got to decentralize policing back down to provincial levels. We agreed constitutionally in 1994 that SAPS would become a national competence. I don't think that served us well given the level of crime that we face. So we need to capacitate by bringing it to a local level so that you can use Metro Police along with South African police services to be effective. Secondly, I think you need strong intelligence on the ground because crime is not committed by a number of citizens. It's committed by the same citizens over and over again. And we can't arrest them. And then ultimately, we've got to fix the criminal justice system. Because when it's said and done, it can't be that the conviction rate for murder is below 20%, which means that you've got a 1 in 5 chance of actually getting arrested from having committed a murder. We have to be much more tighter on that and make sure that really criminals end up behind bar and that ultimately that when there's a murder, and I would like to say this to the South African Police Service, that it's not about policing. I know this may be hard for people to hear. It's not about policing every crime. It's about saying ultimately the priority number one is murder and violence. And if you commit that in this country, you should know that all measures will be taken to deal with you from all levels because the other socio-economic issues contribute to other sets of crime, such as maybe burglary, etc. And I'm not saying that's lesser. Of course it is lesser. But when it comes to the question of murder, we must be deliberate and say, if you commit murder in this country, we will lock you away and make sure that you don't get out of jail easily.
Mmusi, I've got to thank you for engaging me on that one. Let's turn back now to the reason why you and I are talking. Of course, there's this bill now that is before Parliament to try and deal with the situation of the electoral laws, the Electoral Act, the amendments that were ordered by that finding in the New Nation judgment, and Parliament missed the deadline of 2 years to remedy that situation of allowing independence at provincial and national level. You are saying that the system can be proportional or fair, but it cannot be both. Let's start there. Why can't it be both? Why can't it be proportional and fair at the same time?
Because ultimately, if you exclusively focus on proportionality in the system, then any votes that are being counted, so if you stand as an independent and for argument's sake, you only need 80,000 votes to get a seat and you get 160,000 votes, it means the second 80,000 votes don't qualify you for another seat. They actually go to the political party. And then the political parties share in the proportional representative aspect of the thing, which means not only for the citizens who have cast that vote, those votes are wasted, but furthermore, that actually, in fact, you are sponsoring a political party system that remains entrenched. So we have to overhaul it entirely by saying that the country must be broken down into constituencies. And that is not a constitutional requirement in that you need to amend the constitution to achieve that. There are already demarcated areas in the country. So you would just take those on and simply say, let's allow voting to occur where people can be allowed to vote in their constituencies and know who they are voting for. So imagine if the people of Soweto, on a day such as this one, would have a member of parliament who they knew directly to say, you must come and give us answers because we must account about what's going on in our neighborhood here in Soweto. That is what we are referring to. Otherwise, if it's just proportional, all you end up with is a system where parties can produce lists and people can stand in areas they don't even come from. And when it's said and done, none of us know who our representatives are. That's where it becomes unfair in that regard.
But here's the big stumbling block for your argument, Mmusi. Proportional representation is embedded in our constitution, that overall the political system should broadly reflect proportional representation. So whatever mechanisms we come out with, even when you read the New Nation judgment, we've got room for individuals to stand for political office and to be elected, but the overall outcome is meant to be to reflect proportional representation, to ensure that the voices that would ordinarily not find hearing in some of the systems end up finding hearing.
Certainly, and what I would argue for is what Van Slabbert argued for, which is rather go for 300-100, which means 300 members of parliament must be directly elected, and then the remaining 100 can be proportionally elected. In fact, in the Ministerial Advisory Committee, it made a recommendation to say it must go 200-200, which means 200 members of parliament can be directly elected, and the second 200 can be proportionally elected. What this current bill does, it achieves neither. It simply just says that independents can stand and be available on the ballot, which means that whilst you might say you are in some way satisfying the proportionality argument, frankly, it's proportional as per political party, not proportional as per the will of the people. So to preserve exactly what you are arguing, which is to say let minority voices be heard, and that's all crucial, we can reduce that to 100 members of parliament that can be elected in that manner. That way, always accountability and responsibility towards the constitution is upheld. The argument here, in some ways, is about the electoral system, but in another way, it's about ending state capture and making sure citizens are always in charge. When politicians don't fear the people, you end up with the consequences that you have today.
And spell out those consequences for me, Mmusi. I know from the various judgments of the Constitutional Court when the issue of Nkandla was, being dealt with at the time, but we've since even moved from that. Even currently, I have my own examples where Parliament could have played its role, but chose to defer to other processes, other spheres of government and other institutions, where for me, in my mind, there was nothing that precluded Parliament from carrying out its own processes that would in no way interfere with the work that the public protector, for example, would be doing, or the work that the police would be doing. I don't want to give my examples, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, and I think there are two real-life examples happening in front of us here. We have a president who, whatever the allegations are around Phala Phala, the truth is he feels much more comfortable to say, I'll go report to the ANC's Integrity Committee, where we don't know, it's in a closed room, nobody can account towards that, and no one voted for the Integrity Committee, instead of in fact going to Parliament, where he would be responsible and accountable to where the representatives of the people would come in. That's a principal example. Furthermore, if you think about the UK system, and I'm not suggesting that it's perfect, in real life right now, there are members of Parliament who said, the Prime Minister has failed us and will step away. And they didn't lose their jobs, they didn't lose their salaries. Instead, they were able to stand up for principle because they knew, they feared their constituents. Now imagine if President Ramaphosa back then, in the eyes of state capture, was able to say, actually, I'm willing to resign because I'm not willing to stand by and watch what is going on. I'd rather resign from the executive, keep my income if that was what he was worried about, and rather fight state capture. But he didn't do that because he knew the party would fire him, and he knew that if you voted against the party in Parliament, you would also be fired. So to me, these are examples of how democracy falls apart in the system as we have it now. And eventually, you start to head down to issues like Charlotte Maxeke in Johannesburg had been burnt down and is now facing another fire. But there's not a single member of Parliament who's willing to stand up and speak on behalf of the people of Johannesburg for healthcare. So to me, it speaks deeply to what democracy, accountability, and representation is about.
Lastly, Mmusi, given everything we've talked about, I imagine then that you find nothing controversial in the recommendation by Chief Justice Raymond Zondo in the last batch of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry report. I've seen a number of people who are saying, how did he end up there with that recommendation? And I imagine, and this is my imagination, I don't know if you will agree with it, that if the diagnosis was that part of what was broken was the institution of the presidency, we've got to look into that. But what is your thinking? I imagine that you don't find the recommendation of a directly elected president to be controversial, albeit with the caveat that the Chief Justice gives, that I'm not saying it will solve all of our problems, but I am saying that it would enhance the accountability and buffers to ensure that only people who have been put through I don't want to say through the eye of the needle, I really don't, but who've been put through the furnace and the testing fire of suitability can qualify for that high office.
Tulasizwe, you know, one of the saddest things about this report when I read it is the fact that I knew many of the issues. Parliament knew many of the issues. We almost didn't need to spend billions of rands with a commission to investigate those issues. If we had men of integrity who feared their public, they would have acted. And so to me, I stand with Judge Zondo when he says that an electoral reform is crucial to end state capture. It's fundamental. Otherwise, it will be in a different color. Today is the anniversary of the last year's unrest, and no one has been held accountable. Surely, we can't have a government that is allowed to be as free as it is. So I support Judge Zondo. I think the recommendations are sound. And I think President Ramaphosa was asked about it when he appeared at Judge Zondo. And I would hope that we will take heed as South Africans to say we need a directly elected president so that that president does not fear Nasrec or the party before they fear the people of this country.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that, Mmusi. And I suppose now at this point, this conversation cannot be deferred any further, like we did in 2003, when Frederick Franzel Slabet came out with that report, as well as the other subsequent references and allusions to the inadequacies of the electoral system as we have it now. We've got to confront it. Let's see how the bill itself then takes shape over the coming months into the next election cycle. Mmusi Maimane of One South Africa, thank you for your time here on ENCA.